This video is brought to you by our amazing supporters over at Patreon. Hey guys, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and today I want to talk about Cuphead. Studio MDHR's Cuphead has inspired many conversations about its difficulty. The game is a visual tour de force, recapturing the look of the early days of cartoon animation, but that visual style is a friendly veneer to a punishing run-and-gun platformer with a focus on multi-stage bosses. It's easy to understand why people talk about how difficult Cuphead is. However, I want to look at why it is so difficult, and how it relates to the early days of console gaming and to the indie game scene today. In the early console era, games were punishingly hard for two reasons. First, they came from the tradition of arcade games, where a more difficult game meant more replays, which was more valuable to the arcade owners who were actually buying the game cabinets. Secondly, there was limited space for content. Even with clever coding, a cartridge could only hold so much data, so having levels that you had to kind of try out and then practice and replay meant more value for the player. But ultimately, difficulty was kind of a necessary evil, and over time games veered away from this difficulty in a number of ways. Which brings us back to Cuphead. Why is a cartoon platformer so punishing? Part of it may be a nostalgia for the difficulty of older games, or that high difficulty in games is back in vogue. However, I think there's a more practical reason as well, which incidentally calls back to the early days of console gaming. Where back in the 80s game content was limited by data storage, Cuphead's content was limited by its production pipeline. As such, difficulty became a necessary element to extend play. And let me clarify, this is not to say that Cuphead is too short or too shallow or that it is not a good game. I'd rather play 5 amazing, enjoyable minutes of a game than 30 hours of mediocre slog. Limited content does not mean low quality. And Cuphead's content isn't even all that limited. There are 28 unique bosses, each with multiple stages. Rather, I'm referring to the idea that were the game easier to play, there would be about a half an hour to an hour of unique content, and that the majority of the game's length comes from the difficulty and need to replay levels. However, from a game development standpoint, the team at Studio MDHR committed to a handcrafted pen and paper animation style, which takes much longer than standard digital graphics pipelines. Working with a small team, this simply meant that they did not have the bandwidth to produce dozens of hours of new content for the player to encounter. I don't know the order things were decided in, but a run-and-gun bullet hell style game is a perfect match for a game where you want people to play levels over and over again until they get good enough to pass them. A difficult game naturally extends the time players will spend with your content. We see these sorts of decisions made in indie games all the time. It's why most indie games are 2D instead of 3D, or use pixel art or a simple art style rather than photorealistic renderings. It's why indie studios use procedural generation in clever new ways rather than handcrafting hundreds of items or enemies or levels. In order to provide more content, small teams have to make sacrifices elsewhere, and that's often in art. Cuphead went the opposite route. And for a game of such high detail and quality, the difficulty is actually a really good thing. If you could buzz through a level of Cuphead in a single playthrough, or even a few, you'd likely just be focused on the mechanics and move on. However, because of the twitch style and perfect play that Cuphead requires, you really need to get in the zone and commit levels to almost a muscle memory, so that you can respond instinctively to what the boss is throwing at you. Once your gameplay is on autopilot, you can really start to appreciate all the detail they've put into the level, from the watercolor backgrounds to the personality of individual projectiles to the nuances of the different stages of a given boss. The time you spend in a level isn't just improving your play, it's the time that you have to admire the world that Studio MDHR has created. So, from a game dev standpoint, I think the difficulty in Cuphead represents two sides of the same coin. It is both the practical result of a time-consuming production process and a means to make the player appreciate the time spent in making a captivating art style. And this is a good thing, because a punishing game shouldn't be about punishment. Rather, difficulty in a game should instill a better understanding of that game world that the player has dared to enter.